This is Isaac Morehouse. Welcome to the podcast where we discuss education, entrepreneurship, big ideas, how to put them into practice in the real world, and above all, how to live free. So the journalism industry today is highly competitive, and a lot of kind of old school journalists, I don't even know if there are any anymore, but you hear complaints about it. The barriers to entry are very low. Anyone can jump on and do it, obviously, because of what the internet has done. And this has created a tremendous amount of competition to get clicks. Today, I'm talking with Robby Soave. He is a staff editor at Reason.com. He also writes for the Detroit News, an old school newspaper. And he's written for the Daily Caller previously. He was a journalist in college at the University of Michigan. And Robby covers everything from education policy to criminal justice to television and pop culture. And we're going to talk a little bit about journalism and what it's like today to be a journalist. How do you keep up? How do you stay relevant and get clicks while still doing good work? So, Robby, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
So first, tell us a little bit about how you became a writer. How did you know that that's what you wanted to do? How did you learn the skills you needed? What was kind of your evolution into this career?
Sure. Well, I always knew I wanted to be a writer ever since I was a kid. I didn't know I would end up as a journalist. I always saw myself like writing fantasy books or something, which maybe one day I'll get there. But in college, I just kind of on a lark, I read something in the Michigan Daily, the student newspaper at the University of Michigan, that I really disagreed with. So I wrote like a column that I submitted to them, and they liked it so much they actually hired me. So like without seeking it out, really, I just kind of got roped into doing journalism in college, and that was my second year of college. And then that kind of came to dominate my entire education at the University of Michigan. I was eventually student editorial page editor. I was writing lots of columns, and I really from that decided that that's the direction I wanted my career to take. So after that, I did internships to land where I am now.
So you have like the opposite of the the traditional like romantic story of, Stephen King getting all of his manuscripts rejected. Like
Yeah.
the first thing you ever wrote, they were like, "Hey, how about a job?"
Yeah. In college, that is how it worked. Although after that, when I got into the real world of journalism, then it was a lot more difficult to make each of those steps when you're starting out.
Well,
Um,
so quickly touch back on the college thing. That first column that you wrote, it was like, oh, I'm annoyed and irritated by this, so I'm going to write a response. Did you have had you done a lot of writing just for yourself or in high school? Were you already like a practiced writer, or was this kind of like, what the heck, I'll take a stab at it? Like, how did you get to the point where, you sort of had the ability to write something good enough to make them want to bring you on at the student newspaper?
I would say I have a natural talent for writing, especially relative to other things. I was an English history kind of student in high school. I really enjoyed my
Did you do a
literature.
lot of reading?
I did a ton of reading. I those were my favorite classes. So I was reading like Lord of the Rings and Dune from a very early
Okay,
age.
so mostly like fiction stuff is what you
Yes.
usually read. Yeah, okay.
Right, but I wasn't super practiced, no, in like the kind of formal opinion argument sort of thing that you do for opinion pieces, and I had absolutely zero training writing like a news story. So it is a kind of different kind of writing, but I did have like basic writing skills and an interest in writing and had practiced it a lot, and that's very important for being good at it, obviously.
So this is a great. I wanted to ask you about this, and I had forgotten. I'm glad you reminded me. Just like maybe last week, I posted a quote from Ray Bradbury about like it was something to the effect of, you can't really learn to be a good writer in college. Writing courses, it's really a bad place to learn that. You just have to basically read a lot and write a lot. And I had all these people commenting on it, and a lot of them like oh, that's not true. Maybe for super gifted people, but you have to be instructed on how to write, etc. What are your thoughts on kind of the role of formal instruction? Let's take journalism specifically. I've talked to a lot of sort of old hands in the journalism or news industry who will say things like journalism school is a waste. If you want to be a good journalist, don't go get a degree in journalism. I mean, what are your thoughts on kind of the formal instruction of learning to be a journalist versus just picking it up through, I don't know, reading and writing and practice?
Yeah, a formal education in journalism, like at a university, is beyond pointless. Um, it's you can't, which is not to say that there's no instruction needed in journalism, but it's a craft, not a philosophical discipline. It's something that you should learn on the job doing. I mean, there's nothing.
So it's not like if you memorize these 10 rules of journalism and are tested on them and you can remember them, you'll be a good journalist. It has to be a sort of
Yeah,
tactile give and take, like while you're doing it.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, and you would learn so much more in just a decent journalism internship than you would. And I don't know, no one would hire you. You know, if you go to the most elite, if you go to the Columbia Journalism School and you do something there, yes, you can get a job. But that takes so much time and effort and money that I don't know why you would rather not spend that like seeking out just like an actual practice crash course internship in journalism where you'll learn virtually the same thing at like much less cost to you.
I've always thought it was funny that all the people I know who are good writers, news writers, journalists, most of them, they learned it high school, college range somewhere from doing a lot of writing, just like you at the student newspaper, etc. And I always think it's interesting when you think about it. 4 years and however much money spent learning, maybe it's English, maybe it's journalism, maybe it's something unrelated, but really the value was writing for that student newspaper. So like instead of going and getting a degree, if you want people, I guess a school for writers, just like set up a student newspaper and and writing for the student newspaper, editing for it, that whole part of the experience, that's where I think most of the value comes for people who want to become writers. Now that's just me looking from the outside, but I know you were very involved in the student newspaper. What was the value of that relative to all of the other sort of formal, things that you were doing in your college, experience?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say this is probably like the main path into journalism. Like what I did is similar to probably the bulk of journalists my age working for the student newspaper, which was just a great education. Yeah, so I learned from people who had started at it a couple years before I did. So they had a lot to teach me, a couple times of having what I'd written torn apart by an editor who went over every word and every sentence, and from the argument to the actual style of writing it, that just improves your writing so quickly. And you have to turn around a lot at the student newspaper. It has a small staff of students putting out a pretty impressive, frankly, newspaper. So you have, some people are writing something every day. So it's a very quick process of improving your writing. And actually, I mean, the funny thing is, so I was doing a lot of writing for my regular classes too. I was an English major, and I found my creative writing classes wonderful for improving my writing. I loved my creative writing professors, and I think it's because they help you, instill some character into your writing, some individual style. But the kind of academic formal writing I was doing for just your generic literature class or something, that writing is so pointless and actively bad because you just like learn to construct very repetitive sort of things. You're trying to get to 8 pages, so you're saying like the same sentences over and over again. Like, what is the point? It's actually making your writing worse because all good writing is as brief as possible, especially nowadays when it's online.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. I was talking to Steve Patterson on an earlier episode a couple weeks ago about citations and how, I used to, you'd get these requirements like you have to cite 5 sources or 10 sources in this paper. And I would just write the paper and then like later just just go look up a bunch of sources and claim that I was, that's where the ideas came from.
Well, it contributes to groupthink in a way because everyone's Googling the same the same prompt. Everyone's coming across the same dozen sources, and everyone's so everyone's turning in similar
Yeah,
papers.
you look up the professor, see what they've written, and then cite those things. You can't go wrong there.
The research paper should not survive in the move to like the internet. I mean, to actually like gauge people's writing in an academic setting, I think you have to have them do like in class essays where they actually, like an enlightened philosopher or
Yeah,
something,
yeah.
actually saying what they think and drawing on knowledge that they have inside them, or else how can you demonstrate they've learned anything?
It's so interesting. Like I just imagine. I mean, why can't you have the college newspaper without the college? Like just
For
take
a
the
fraction of the cost.
right, exactly. For if you want to learn to write. Well, so this is a good segue too. So you kind of started writing in a newspaper setting that had a high frequency of stuff that you're pumping out. So it's not like I'm going to sit down and write, this great epic work that's going to last and make an impact for generations. No, you're writing articles that people are going to forget about 2 days after they read them, but they're going to talk about them for a day or two. I know U of M is a very kind of politically charged or politically engaged campus. There's, everything's turned into a controversy by certain student groups and whatever. And it's got kind of an energy to it. So you started writing in what many people consider to be like the scariest venue. That's a venue where everything you say, there's probably someone who's going to disagree with it openly. There's immediate market feedback. People will rip on you or, write letters about how much your stuff was inaccurate or it sucked. You're immediately exposed to, and again, in a more limited sense at the university level, but it's still there. It's still that market feedback. It's not like writing your short story that no one's ever seen and you're working on it for 2 months, behind closed doors. It's like cranking stuff out and having that pressure. What was that like? Do you ever feel like you can't really be yourself because you have to write things that will get people's attention and that will appeal to the mass market?
That is there is that trade-off a little bit. Because you can write just whatever you want as long as you want. You could write a 10,000 word diatribe about your views and publish it on your blog, and no one will ever read it. And if that's fulfilling to you,
I've
you
done it
can do
before.
that. Right. I mean, people keep it's like a version of keeping a diary. People have kept diaries for hundreds of years. So there's nothing wrong with that. I am not like that. I want people to read what I'm writing. I'm conditioned to write for readers, for an audience. So I pick topics, and I never let that dictate like what I'm actually saying, but it dictates the topics I choose. I choose newsy topics, things that I think will get people talking. I don't write the actual content in a way that's deceptive or provocative, but I think it's fine and in fact necessary to market it in the most flashy way possible by choosing headlines and pictures and things like that are going to cause people to stumble over what you're writing. I
Robby
mean, the headline
Soave
saves
did a
you.
podcast interview. You won't believe what happened next.
Exactly. That construction, and you can't annoy people. Like people hate that construction now.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, these things have kind of short shelf lives. Like,
exactly.
whatever, Upworthy. They had this new way of, you know, phrasing things and everybody clicked and then it's like 2 weeks in, we're all tired of it. You gotta be innovative in a way. So
Yeah,
I
I
do.
like to tell them as much as I possibly can in the headline.
Huh,
they've got to be short, but I like to cram as much information. Be like, look, this happened to this person. It's outrageous. Read.
huh. Um, I want to get back to in a few minutes that sort of tension and how you get a lot of clicks and a lot of traction and what that's like as a writer. But um, just on a more personal level, you said you write for an audience. That's what you like to do. What what motivates you? When you get up, because you're productive. You crank out. I just pulled up your archives on Reason, and some days you're writing 3 articles. You write one pretty much every day. Some days 2 or 3. Um, what motivates you when you get up? What's your daily schedule? Do you have habits and rules for yourself to keep cranking it out? And what sort of keeps the fire burning for you?
Yeah, well, there are like soft rules, like kind of terms of my employment things. Like I should be writing between 1 and 3 things a day. I have a couple editing tasks, but I look at it that I want to reach more people every day. I pay very close attention to my web traffic numbers, to the number of people clicking on my articles a day, and to the number of people sharing my articles on Facebook and Twitter, and to the number of other journalists, prominent journalists, people with larger platforms than I have, when they respond to my articles. That thrills me. When they have taken time, when they've seen something of value or something to criticize in what I've written, and it actually appears at National Review or at Salon or at Talking Points Memo or other places picking up on what I'm writing. I love that. So those are the big successes I look for. I want to have.
So
Uh,
so it's almost that thrill. Somebody told me once, and I found it like, okay, the first time you see your name in print, no
yeah.
matter how much you think you don't care, you'll be excited. You'll get a high from it. Um, and it's true. And that's something that most people, maybe you write a letter to the editor once, or you have a blog post that gets picked up, or even like a Facebook status that gets 100 likes, and people are like, okay, that's really exciting. That's really fun. I often wonder, does that still work? And it sounds like from what you're telling me, like you still get that high, that charge, that like, yes, let's go see oh my gosh, this one blew up. Like that really kind of motivates you regularly, huh?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Daily. Same thing every day. Yeah, I am thrilled to see the Facebook shares coming in and to see people. And I enjoy seeing my name in print when I occasionally write something for a newspaper. But the web traffic and the sharing and like those things are built into the business side of what I do too. I mean, they're what I'm was hired to do, to build an audience for our content. So it's not so that's like a perfect overlapping of what I want out of my career in life and what I've been brought on at Reason Magazine to do.
Yeah, I love to hear you say that I love to see my name in print. I love to get the stuff out there. Like I want as many readers as possible because there's this obsession with, I think, like false humility with everyone having to pretend to be humble. I mean, you see it in everything from like post game interviews with athletes. It's like they all have to do the obligatory, like, oh, no, 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 like it wasn't me. And that no one should ever admit that, like, hey, I just want a huge audience. I want lots of attention. I want to see my name in lights. You're supposed to be like, well, I really just do it because of the content, whatever else. And I'm not saying that you don't care about the content. I know you do. But to hear that honesty is refreshing. And I think it's refreshing not only because it's probably true of most of us and most people just don't say it, but also because it's dangerous. There's a vulnerability there. Once you've publicly said, I want to get a ton of traction, I want to be widely read, I want my stuff to get out there. Now, if it's not, people are like, oh, Robby failed, right? Whereas if you pretend, oh, I'm not doing this for the hits, I'm just doing this for myself, then like you can't fail, right? You can't set you. And I think there's something that I really respect and admire about you saying like, look, I want to blow it up, I want to get traction. That's what motivates me. So good for you. All right, let me ask you before we move back to the clickbait topic, because I'm really interested in that. So, like a typical day, I mean, you've got to write 1 to 3 things and do some editing. You work remotely, and you have a pretty good degree of flexibility, it sounds like, in sort of the when and the how you write, and even the what that you write about. What does your typical day look like? Do you have a regular routine to keep you productive? Are you like Hemingway, where you spend the first 4 hours of the day writing and then you go get drunk, or what?
Yeah, it's definitely one of the things about journalism that are not as conducive to a commercial for journalism, I guess. Like, oh, this is so great, you want to do it too, is the difficult work day. I have no definite schedule. I get up mostly at the same time in the morning, but just some days I am still writing at 3 in the morning. I mean, that happens usually at least once a week.
Is that because you're responding to news items?
Yeah, I mean, yes. I
Okay.
mean, it's partly preference. Like some people can't write that late, and I am still kind of like lucid and do some of my best writing late at night. But sometimes it's unavoidable when something just happens at 11 p.m. And and because I have the a drive to have a lot of traffic and a lot of success that way. Well, I want to. One of the surest ways to kind of blow it up is to get to it first. So I will respond to things at kind of insane times. So that means I'm kind of on the clock like 24 hours a day.
So how do you manage like downtime? Like how do you make sure that you get some R&R, or whether it's just a couple hours here and there during a regular day, or take a vacation? Because I imagine that you can condense the hours that it takes to write 2 or 3 articles into a relatively small time frame, but because you have to be so responsive to things, I mean, does that make you like sort of unable to, I don't know, go out on a date with your wife or whatever?
Well, in some ways, I'm more flexible because, I'm like, we went to Florida last week. That was fine. I didn't really take any time off work. I took like a day, the day we were traveling. But, the rest of the time when there was something I needed to do, I could just, I could sit out by the beach and I have my laptop and that's all I need. If we want to, babysit our nephews or take them to the zoo or something, we can probably do that. I can probably step away for a couple hours pretty much any day. But by the same token, like last Easter, there was breaking news with a case I followed at the University of Virginia. This sort of debacle over Rolling Stones reporting about a crime at the University of Virginia, and the report was coming out on Easter. So I was there with my family on my laptop open, typing 3 different opinion articles that I was wanting to submit to different sites, including the coverage I was doing for Reason. So you have that too, and that's happened to me on more than one holiday.
So one of the struggles that I have, and it's a different industry, but there's a similarity to it, in the sense that you have to be mentally engaged basically 24 hours a day. Like you can't completely unplug. So running a startup company where there's a lot going on, it's okay. Yes, there's flexibility. You can go to the beach during the middle of the day with your kids, and that's great. You've got your phone, you can check your emails. So you're there physically, as you mentioned, taking your nephews to the zoo. But I don't know if your wife has ever accused you of this, but mine certainly has. But you're not fully there mentally, because you've always got to be sort of plugged in, like, checking your email. Oh, let me just quickly respond to this. So is that ever a struggle for you or for your wife? Do you ever feel like you're unable to sort of be fully present in those moments, even though you're physically there because you have the flexibility?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're always getting emails. Journalists do a lot of arguing on Twitter, like a lot of it, and some of it is quite productive for the work that you're doing. Other times it's hard to tell, but it's part of building a profile of you and engaging journalists who are going to read your work. More important journalists.
Huh.
But I always have Twitter open. Sometimes people are responding to me at crazy hours. So sometimes I'm answering on the phone. So yeah, it does. It's exactly what you said. I'm always plugged in. I'm never in off mode. I think, for better or worse, this is kind of like just increasingly a thing for everyone now that it's so easy to talk to people everywhere at all times because of the modern world that we live in. But it's definitely hit things like what you do and things like journalism, hit them first.
Yeah, it's one of those things, and I am always so irritated by any big sweeping claims that are like, things are so much worse than they used to be, and people never spend time together, blah blah. I always think that stuff is like, it's like set in a vacuum. It's not compared to anything in the real world. I don't buy it. I think that there are challenges with every new technology, but there's equal, if not more, opportunity. So the way I see it is like, yes, absolutely, you now have the ability, if you want to, or simply if you don't sort of seize control of your own habits in your own life, to feel like you are kind of being controlled by this constant connectivity. It just means that before you didn't struggle with that just because it wasn't an option, even if you wanted to struggle with it. Now you have the option to be constantly connected if you want to, and it puts the onus on you. With more opportunity comes more responsibility to kind of decide if and to what extent you want to do that. So it is a challenge, but I also see it as like, I don't know. I always get irritated when people are like, oh, the world today, everyone is, no one has real conversations anymore. And it's like, well, you can if you want to,
Having real conversations while we do our backbreaking farm labor.
Yeah, exactly.
But and I see it though as I don't plan to be plugged in writing things at 3 a.m. my whole life. This is an investment period where I'm working as hard as I can, building my profile and as maximizing away as I can. Understanding that I can't keep doing what I'm doing right now forever. I will absolutely burn out. But hopefully I'll get myself to a position where I have an even more lofty perch where I can write more occasionally, but it'll be the same output roughly because I have so many people reading me at that point. And that way I won't have to fight with, the next younger version of myself who comes along and is, working even longer hours to try to beat me. Hopefully by then I'll be beyond that because of the work I'm doing now.
Yeah.
I look at it.
Yeah, I think it's a very reasonable way to look at it. And one of the things, I tell myself the same thing, and then, part of me is like, I don't even fully know. I won't know, I guess, until I get there if I'm actually addicted to the I might miss it if I try to transition away, but I guess we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Let me ask you about, okay, so I like to play this game. I've told you about this before, where, I'm on my Facebook or Twitter and I see Reason articles. I love Reason. I subscribe on both of those things, so I'll see things pop up. And I like to play this game without letting myself look at the author. And sometimes the author, it usually isn't listed if it's just like a tweet or whatever. I have to guess if it's a Robby article based purely on the headline. And I'm like really good at this. I'm like 90% accuracy because your headlines are so good. Your headlines are so clearly designed to make me say, holy crap, that sounds like a huge scandal. Oh my gosh, I have to see what this is. You are fully engaged in this world where getting the clicks is king, and you've got to appeal to a very large number of people, at least in your target demographic, whatever that niche might be, but it's still a pretty broad appeal. You've got to compete with a lot of noise, a lot of well-funded places, a lot of, cheesy, clickbaity, BuzzFeed type stuff, whatever it is. You have to appeal to people who are on Twitter constantly. How do you feel about that, and how do you balance trying to be sensational and exciting and get those clicks and writing those kind of headlines with writing the kind of content and stories that you want to write? Do you find it to be a struggle?
It's less of a struggle than you might think because, I really do think the things I'm writing about are outrageous and people should want to hear about them, and that people will be like, oh wow, when they read some of the things I write about. I cover a lot of and this is relevant to what you do. I cover a lot of what's messed up in the formal university higher education sphere. And I think it is outrageous. I cover a lot of cases of students who are bullied by their universities for for stepping one toe out of line, or for saying something, or for having this event. All things totally covered by the Bill of Rights, by the First Amendment. Nothing that they should get in trouble for. I've covered students who were suspended for handing out copies of the Constitution. I mean, it's just like crazy, and everyone, left, right, everyone is outraged to hear that. So I don't need to invent crazy content.
You don't need to write, find out why dentists in New Jersey hate this housewife, or the cure for aging you'll never believe.
Yeah.
It's funny, Robby. So when I shudder to think of this, I almost hate mentioning it because it just gives me horrible flashbacks. When I used to work in the state legislature in Michigan, I had this epiphany, and maybe this is unfair, But we were there day in and day out, seeing all the sessions, seeing the lobbyists come and buy the lawmakers lunch, seeing the lawmakers making backroom deals, hearing just the stupid, sometimes just ignorant, sometimes scandalous stuff that they would say and do. The whole process, the whole sausage making process was just so backward and ugly and inefficient and absurd and really scandalous. Like if voters knew this. And what I was amazed by, there was, a little gaggle of Capitol Hill or, in Lansing, the Capitol journalists there. And some of them were better than others. But for the most part, I came to the conclusion that journalists, the media, it's not so much that they're like biased towards one party or the other. They may or may not be, but it's more that they're just like lazy biased. And I felt like if anybody just followed any given politician around for like a couple days and literally just factually reported or just videotaped what they do, you wouldn't have to sensationalize or spin anything. The average voter, the average reader would find the everyday business of government just scandalous. Like every day there's crazy stuff that normal people would find scandalous if someone just took the time to follow it and report it. And so what you're doing, I'm not surprised that you feel like you don't have to manufacture hype and make something sound crazy. Like there's just crazy stuff going on in these massive bureaucracies. Why do you think there's not more journalism like what you do? Why are more reporters not sort of just telling the crazy stuff that goes on all the time? Are they afraid that they'll lose like sources or what's the reason for that?
I don't know precisely, but there are. I think there are biases, like of a different, like of a not an across the board. This is the bias, but it depends specifically what you're doing. Like if you're a newspaper editorial writer writing like the unsigned op-ed, those clearly have a bias for simple answers, probably because they have no individual voice, from no person. They can't bring in any of a person's experience. So it's always going to be. So it's so often, the commission should do this, the government should pass this law, because they need simple answers. Whereas like talking heads on news shows, they have a very ideological audience one way or the other, so they're giving over the top ideological answers. So it's just like a clear bias for the way their individual thing is set up. And unfortunately, I don't think, maybe in a lot of those fields, it doesn't reward the very just nitty gritty, explore this outrageous thing that people in a very nonpartisan way will be outraged about. And I do think, however, the rise of more like journalism, news websites has clearly tipped the scales toward doing more of that. And you have sites, even sites that don't play nice with me, on occasion, doing that sort of thing for their various, the Gawkers and BuzzFeeds and even places, that were once more like magazine places are doing that kind of thing.
It's interesting the sort of the possibility in this era of increased transparency. I feel like it's taken the news industry a long time to slowly catch up, and they've kind of been forced to by a lot of these like plucky upstarts or like citizen journalists or just people with a camera phone. You catch something on your camera phone and post it to Reddit or whatever. It's a story just because it's interesting in and of itself, whether or not some reporter went out and did all the work. So I think, when I was at the Capitol, there was a handful again of sort of older reporters who it's like, okay, I could spend all kinds of time following this person around and reporting on all this crazy, free handouts they're getting and all this stuff that would make voters go crazy. But then they'll be mad at me. And frankly, the whole establishment will be mad at me. And at the end of the day, like, this is a job for me. I go to lunch with these people. Like, this is my social circle. Why would you want to like piss off everybody that you work with every day? And for what? A short-term hit in like one news story. It's easier to just kind of take the press release, write it up into something, and just keep cranking it out. It was just kind of like it was almost like a 9-to-5 mentality where I thought, man, if some young person who had no concern about being liked by any of these people just wanted to, there'd be so much more interest, and it would blow away all the boring stuff that these people are writing. What happened at the committee meeting, and you're seeing that it's come from kind of outside of the official journalism world, it seems to me anyway, and it sort of pressured them to transform. But you're seeing more of that. even just the transparency. Hey, look, now you can watch the whole whatever political hearing, or you can see there's WikiLeaks, there's all this stuff that the content almost tells the story itself without having to have a sort of professional wordsmith go around and do as much background work. There was supposed to be a question in there, but I just ended up talking for a long for a long time. Um,
But
Go ahead.
that goes to that it's very it's impossible for a unsuccessful journalist to hide. You have nowhere to go, and
No,
that's
no
what.
one's no one's gonna employ you anymore and give you a pension to just be on staff.
No, and you can tell if someone's doing well because you can see the product is available. You see what they're producing. You can know, broadly speaking, how many people are reading it because you can kind of see other people's traffic, even people you don't work with, or you can judge by the Facebook shares on the article, and you can judge by who else is responding to them, and you can judge it for yourself by reading the article. So it's a very kind of straightforward thing where it's easy to tell everyone's standings. And in some ways, that it's very easy to thrive as a relatively inexperienced person who's just doing a good job anyway, because you are going to get noticed.
Hmm.
And I've gone so quickly from being a total no one who would like. I remember the first time an important journalist who is Andrew Sullivan, who has his own blog, and he was formerly of Time and some other places. Like he cited me in some argument right when I was starting out, and I thought that was so cool. And I've gone from that to now every week I have a couple larger journalists talk back to me in a relatively short amount of time. Really, I've only been at this a couple years, so I think that's kind of spectacular relative to other fields you could choose to go into.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. So, Robby, you cover a lot of, as I mentioned, and you mentioned, education and a lot of, sort of corruption, scandal, or just outrageous things happening, whether it's K through 12 or universities. You also do some criminal justice type stuff. And some of your big stories that have had kind of ongoing, that you've been reporting on an ongoing basis of the developments, have been things like this big rape accusation scandal at the University of Virginia. You often are doing things like whether it's teachers unions sort of exposing things that shenanigans that they're up to, or things like these rape accusations, or censorship on campus. These are charged, controversial things, and I've seen a lot of the back and forth, particularly on the University of Virginia rape thing, where like people are calling you names, or anybody who's involved in the debate, where it's a highly charged environment where you can easily make like enemies. How has it been hard for you, even going back to the University of Michigan? Is it hard for you to be writing on controversial things, and how do you deal with like pissing people off based on what you write?
Well, you do have to have a moderately thick skin, I think, to do journalism nowadays, and maybe always you did. Uh, that said, no one is thick-skinned enough to withstand some of the things that I've been involved in, and tons of other journalists are involved in. What I think is so helpful that I do, that I think has been wise, is that I never lash out back. I will respond. I will argue back and forth, and sometimes they're heated arguments, but I never, or I try very hard not to, and I think I rarely do. Maybe I call people names back or say really mean, nasty, cruel things when people are saying the same to me, and that has worked so well because the other person doesn't know doesn't know what to do. And when I'm like, they look like the fool when they're yelling obscenities at me, and I'm just like calmly responding to what like that always backfires on that person. And I've had people I have had people apologize. I've had people apologize to me formally in like formal articles when everything cooled down, and it saw that I was right, and their criticisms were unwarranted, and certainly the hateful things they said were unwarranted. So that's my personal, and it's not because I'm not upset. Like I'm not totally detached from the world, and it doesn't affect me at all. I'm sitting at my computer at home, and be like, I'll say to my wife, I can't believe what this person's saying. So like I'm mad on my end, but I just take a deep breath. I don't let it show. I don't lash out, and so many journalists make the mistake of doing the opposite. Maybe that works for them. Maybe that gets them more attention. I mean, I certainly make enemies, but I don't think I make like people are going to come kill me because
have you
personal.
have you ever written something that you regret writing?
Certainly, I've written things I regret writing over my career. I don't think I've written anything I regret in the last year since coming to reason. I do. I'll share the thing I regret writing the most, which I learned from. This was at the Daily Caller. I was doing reviews. I was doing TV reviews, and I reviewed an episode of Game of Thrones, and I spoiled. A character had died, and people were so mad at me. People who had been
did you not put spoiler alert in the title?
No, I just I think I used the image of the character who had died, and I said you can't you won't wait to find out who died or something like that. People who have been reading my writing since I was in college, who have followed me for years, when I was blogging about Lost during college,
Yeah.
people stuck with me that long, messaged me to say they were done. They couldn't believe what I had did, and they were not going to read me anymore. I mean, that hurt me like really bad. I felt so bad for this. I changed it. At first, my first impulse was to defend it. I'm like, well, it's after it's aired now. I'm a news website. How long?
It's your own fault. Come on,
Well, I mean, it's an interesting question. Like how, Darth Vader is Luke's father. Have I now spoiled Star Wars?
You bastard! I didn't know.
It's a question. How long people should be reasonably expected to be out in the world and protected from spoilers? But okay, obviously this was the day after. I think it hadn't aired. So I felt terrible. That definitely taught me a lesson about. I think I've definitely dialed it back since those days of like putting it all in the headline.
This is such a great example of so many things we've been talking about that you've written on, as I mentioned, rape accusations, very sensitive topic, very highly charged. You've written about corruption in all levels of government. You've written about sex scandals and etc. And the thing the thing you've taken the most heat for and that you feel the most bad about is a spoiler on Game of Thrones. I absolutely love it, Robby. I absolutely love it. You can never predict what's gonna rile people up, and I wouldn't even say, I'm not one of those people who says, oh, it's a reflection of how people have the wrong priorities. I actually think they have the right priorities. They have more ability to gain value from watching Game of Thrones than they do to gain value from, voting in the next election or being highly engaged in the political news cycle. So I don't think that's a negative reflection on your audience at all, that they got more upset about that than the other stuff.
I am totally with you on that. But these shows are like beautiful storytelling devices, and I mean they improve my writing from getting this is how you construct a compelling narrative. Like that is important too in what I do. And in a lot of these sort of college things, sometimes they're first person adventure stories of the terrible things that happen to one student or another. So I actually think we do have a lot to learn about great storytelling from the awesome TV shows we have to watch these days.
Well, I'm gonna in a minute here, before we end, ask you a bit more about TV, but briefly, what are your favorite kind of stories, and what have you learned from covering the education system in particular?
What do you mean favorite kind of story? Like favorite kind of
Yeah, like what's your favorite thing to write about? What do you just love? Like, oh, this is going to be a great one.
I love writing about the kind of college speech issue stories I told you about.
So like politically correct attempts to squelch like anything that might offend somebody else on college campuses.
Yes, but a lot of these are so far divorced from any sort of political context, and they stretch back into K through 12, back through to little kids. I've covered, a kid who was suspended for writing a story about a dinosaur because violent content in that story. I've written about a girl who was, suspended for a diary entry that the school somehow confiscated her diary or something. Like
Wow.
there is so much that is outrageous to everyone, and it's it's optimistic in a way. Like people don't have. They don't go, oh well, this isn't my people. I'm for this. I'm against it. Like everyone is against this kind of thing.
Yeah.
It's kind of bringing us together in a way, despite doing it in a despite it being a charged subject. I think there's a lot of coming together on it.
I think that work like what you're doing with education, what I know you do a little bit with, justice as well, but people like Radley Balco and others are doing with police abuse and misconduct. I agree with you that I think it's a powerful uniting force and a force for social change and more accountability to these inept, power hungry bureaucracies and government systems because it's not it's not like the old Woodward and Bernstein, the old like, hey, here's one corrupt guy, one corrupt politician, and a story about one big lie or scandal. It's a constant drip of every school district, every university, every, police force, just like every day there's another abuse, scandal, misuse. And it helps reinforce this sort of public choice theory insight, which I'm a big fan of, that it's not that we need to elect better people. It's not that we just need to get more involved in the, whatever, getting better candidates there. It's predictable, systematic failure anytime you have a monopolized, government run product or service, whether that be law enforcement or education, and just reminding people like governments can't do all these wonderful things they promise you that they'll do. When you see what they're really like day to day, it's like every government department is like the DMV, except for some of them have guns and tanks, but the same dysfunction. And just that constant reminder, it sort of puts constraints. This the same way that one of my favorite economists, Pete Becky, says that economics puts constraints on our utopias. I think your kind of transparency, investigative journalism puts constraints on our utopias. It reminds us every day, let's stop and think before we say, hey, there's a problem. Maybe government can solve it. Because everywhere we look, it's stories of government ineptitude at every level. Maybe we should hold off on asking government to solve the next problem because they might have all these other, issues involved. I think that's a really important feature of what you're doing.
I think so too, and I think journalism can play a very important role in explaining why those things are like that. Because sometimes people wouldn't believe it if they just heard it. They're like, "Oh, well, I wouldn't believe that. That cop would just shoot a kid. People don't do that. Why would he do that?" No, well, there was no camera watching him. He has this history of bad behavior. He had, he
He knows that in the justice system, the odds that a cop will get prosecuted are zero. Like, the incentives are all wrong. There's deep fundamental issues.
because people do behave rationally. So we need to like show why they're doing what made sense to them given all these things. Just one other example of this, the big story that I was working on with the University of Virginia, the student who claimed she was this victim of this terrible, horrific crime that none of it has actually happened. We've now determined, and people are like, well, why would she lie? Why would she make this up? How did she expect to get away with it? And I'm like, she must just be crazy. And I'm like, well, I mean, clearly she's disturbed, but she actually behaved quite rationally. Every time her story was going to fall apart, she withdrew. Like she told this story to friends to get, in a position of importance in her social circle. And then when this reporter started writing about it, whenever the reporter asked for details that would have exposed the lie, she withdrew. She stopped answering. She said, no, 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 don't write about me anymore. Then finally, when the reporter was like, okay, never mind, I won't ask any of these clarifying details, are we good? And she's like, oh, certainly. So she had the wherewithal to know to protect her lie. So she behaved totally rationally
Hmm.
from perspective of someone who wants to like thrive off this lie. And I think it's so important to understand that, and that's why the reporter did a terrible job, because she didn't investigate these kinds of things. And so that shows you the power of good journalism and what it can do responsibly to try to figure out those things.
Oh man, I mean, I think that, rational choice theory, to use the sort of academic terminology, or just economic thinking, applying that bar. Okay, let's assume rationality here and try to understand, given the beliefs, the incentives, the information that the person had at the time, why would they believe acting in this way was beneficial to them or the most rational, given the choices that they thought they had. And I think doing that, instead of allowing ourselves to immediately turn it into a morality tale of good and evil. Oh, this is an evil person, therefore they just did an evil thing with no explanation. It has no rationality to it. It wasn't even good for them. It didn't even get them to their end. Like the stupid villains in the movies that like don't even achieve their own stated goal because they're so irrationally evil that they like whatever, kill their own customers who are going to make them rich. I think removing that and not letting ourselves go there makes us so much better at discovering the truth and actually gaining enlightenment, whether it's in current events or just analysis of society through the social sciences or whatnot. Okay, I just have a couple more questions for you. I don't want to keep you too long, but one is just sort of on a personal note, and I don't know if this is just your personality or if you cultivate this intentionally. You are always a happy guy when I see you, and not just like la 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 happy. Like, you genuinely seem to enjoy life. You write about a bunch of horrible stuff that's happening pretty much all the time. You get people pissed off frequently, but you are not jaded or cynical. You just seem you haven't had to like be like a sarcastic, jaded like critic to cope with all the crap that you had to put up with and write about. It doesn't seem to bother you. You just sort of make jokes, have a good time. You seem to really enjoy your life and be very happy, despite kind of being in the muck all the time. Is that just who you are naturally, or have you had to cultivate that ability to not let it sort of wear you down?
Well, I am definitely a naturally like happy person. I've had a good life. I've had certainly no more struggles than the next person, probably fewer. But I think I like to think that I'm well informed about the things I'm covering, and being well informed, broadly speaking, I think supports an optimistic outlook. I mean, sometimes what I'm writing about is frequently how the kind of we're doomed thinking is totally over the top and wrong. I mean, I've been writing about campus sexual assaults and how we can address those. But if you look at like over time, I rates of sexual assault have plummeted. Rates of murder have plummeted. Like by every metric, we are less violent than we were 20 years ago by a gigantic factor. So we're richer than we were. We have there's less poverty. We're not running out of resources. We kind of like we have good lives. So everything is kind of getting better. So I think a lot of what I do is almost talking people off the cliff, or talking other journalists off the cliff, like, oh, this is all about to fall apart, which is not to say we don't have problems. Things can be going in a positive direction, and individual facets of that are going backward. I think you would have a hard time arguing that like our education system, broadly speaking, is moving in a positive direction, or has been moving in a positive direction for the last 20 years. And certainly sexual assault on campus is an issue, but young women are more likely to be sexually assaulted off a campus. At campuses are like relatively safe places for privileged people. So there's a certain amount of I think skepticism that I bring to this everything is falling apart mentality, even though I write about some pretty awful things. And they're things we should address. We don't need to, and maybe that gives me more credibility to address the kind of individual instances of failure. There is certainly racism in our criminal justice system. There is certainly the cost of college is out of whack, and I write about these things and I try to explain why they're the case. But they are not, symptoms in a pattern of the whole world going to hell.
That's one thing that I absolutely love and appreciate about your writing, your perspective, and frankly, Reason more broadly. And they've been doing this for for decades is that ability to dive into an individual story and talk about it and all the horrible things, the scandal, the corruption, but to constantly maintain that broader perspective and to actually look at what's happening in the world and be able to tell two stories. Here are the specific things that are bad, and here's how bad they are, but it's within this broader context of progress and a lot of good things. Okay, the school system's really screwed up, but technology and just a more dispersed information, more and more people are leaving the school system, creating other options. In general, human knowledge is not declining, even though standard test scores might be, whatever. That ability to maintain those perspectives and to be serious about both of them, to take problems seriously, but also put it in context. It's so important. I was talking with a friend recently about, you could ask a time traveler, if you lived, went back 100 years and somebody in 1900 said, what's the future like? You could tell two different stories, totally different stories, both true. You could say, oh, we're going to have two horrendous world wars. Hundreds of millions of people are going to die. We're going to drop a nuclear bomb. There's going to be a Great Depression. There's going to be hyperinflation. There's going to be gulags. There's going to be fascism, communism. You could tell all these stories, totally true. You could also say everyone's going to be driving around in cars that are temperature controlled. We're going to have these smartphones in our hand. We're going to be flying into outer space, right? These are both true stories, and they both need to be told. And I think that's a really important feature of your sort of pointing out the flaws nested within a broader big picture optimism. Okay, so Robby, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you before we go, because you do love television and good stories. You got me into the show Lost, and I followed your blog religiously, trying to have you explain to me what had happened in every episode after I watched it. You told me about the show Fringe, which I also really enjoyed. What shows are you into right now, and what should I be watching?
What should Isaac Morehouse be watching?
Yes, I need your insight. You're like my TV shrink.
Well, I think we've argued a little bit about The Walking Dead, which I enjoy and watch, but has a lot of flaws. But I would recommend to people anyway.
I do like it. I do like it a lot. There are things that bug me about it, but I do still like it.
Yeah. The Americans is a great show that people should be watching. That's getting its due.
Okay, I've heard a lot of people tell me that. I'll have to go check that one out. That's like a Cold War era, like spy thriller type of thing.
Yeah, spy thriller, but it's these deep undercover Russian spies living in the 80s in America with two kids. So it's sort of their marriage is like a metaphor for the Cold War. And it's very harshly condemning of capitalism. It's actually been called like the most neoconservative show ever on television because it presents like great justification for like attacking the Soviet Union. But it's really enjoyable, even if you agree with it or not. So that show and Better Call Saul, the sequel to Breaking Bad.
Yeah. Is that so? That's worth checking out.
Very, very, very worth.
Such a brilliant character on that show, Breaking Bad. I loved it.
Yeah. So that's what Game of Thrones always. I'm watching everything on HBO right now.
I'm just about to get into Game of Thrones. I haven't started it yet, so I'm way behind. Thanks. All right, well, I won't read your spoiler.
Yeah. Don't read any of my $10 article. I did change that headline.
Oh.
Make that mistake again. But let me know when you see that. We'll have to chat about it.
I absolutely will. Do you have any words of advice or wisdom for any aspiring writers out there?
My words of advice are just do it, just write. Just if you're in college, work for your newspaper. If you're not, you can still find internship. I mean, it's easy to get an internship. You won't make a lot of money. You might make no money at first, but that's the great thing about it. That's why they can take you on, because you don't have demands. And just actually do things. Just actually write. Just sitting around like at a newspaper or at a magazine or at the headquarters for a website, you're not going to succeed just by sitting around. You have to actually write something.
My guest has been Robby Soave. You can find him at reason.com, and you can also find him on Twitter and Facebook. Robby, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.